I go? Wake up! Sorry. Dad, you promised.
Okay. I'm up.
Yeah!
Everything the light touches is our kingdom.
Wow. What about that shadowy place?
That's beyond our borders. You must never go there, Simba.
But I thought a king can do whatever he wants.
Oh, no.
What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and we're continuing to talk about 10th edition reveal articles, this time with Demons of Chaos. Now, the Demons of Chaos article has followed a little bit of the trend of a lot of these articles in that it reveals some mechanics, but a lot of the overarching context is kind of still a mystery. This one even more so because it seems that unlike other factions who have a lot of their mechanics built around other units within their roster that were not previewed in the article, I'm looking at you, Necron article, this one is designed around missions, and we still don't know what the missions look like more than the two preview articles that we've gotten so far, which means a lot of the context of the army abilities for Chaos Demons is still entirely unknown. It depends a lot on the placement of objective markers on the table. That said, we do get the confirmation of a couple core rules in this article that I think are really important. The first one being that melee attacks only use a single weapon profile. That was assumed looking at the previews of melee stat lines for units like Rabute Gilliman and Abaddon, where they had two obscenely powerful melee attacks, and being able to use both of them together would be ludicrous, but much more reasonable if they get to pick one. The Demons article has confirmed that that is how that works. However, some weapons will have the extra attack characteristic. This gives you a number of additional attacks in addition to whatever weapon you pick using that weapon. The other one is objective control value, and this one was hinted at very heavily in other articles, but not ever confirmed. If you have an objective control value of 0, you functionally cannot control objectives. The control of objective requires that you outnumber your opponent with OC value on that objective, and if all of your units holding an objective are OC 0, you and your opponent are essentially tied. So OC 0 models are basically meaningless when it comes to holding objectives and projecting their weight onto objectives to take it from your opponent. That's all good to know, but the real question is how it meshes into Demons specifically, so let's dive in. Now, the most important thing to talk about is the Demons army rule, the Shadow of Chaos, and this is a little bit of an interesting mechanic. Basically, it does very little by itself. It just affects battle shock tests. However, it will interact with a lot of other army abilities. So the Shadow of Chaos army rule determines which portions of the battlefield are within the Shadow of Chaos. Your deployment zone is permanently shadowed.
You must never go there, Simba.
For the no man's land between both players' deployment zones and the opponent's deployment zone, those become shadowed when you control at least half of the objective markers within that area. Importantly, this happens at the start of a phase, meaning that if you are trying to manipulate deep striking, for example, and you want your shadow to project into the center of the table, you need to have controlled that at the start of the movement phase. So there are going to be some situations which this actually becomes extremely difficult. This is why I say that the placement of objectives is crucially important for understanding how this army functions, and it's just something we don't know yet. A lot of missions in 9th edition have 2 objective markers towards each player's deployment zone, but have an odd number in the center, meaning that you will essentially need to control all of the objective markers on your side of the table, plus the 1 objective marker dead middle. There are some 6 objective missions where the objective markers are just distributed evenly between both players' deployment zones and no man's land, meaning that holding the objectives on your side of the table at the start of your movement phase will shadow the center of the table. But it depends a lot on what type of objective card you draw or are given for the game that you're playing in. Assuming that the distribution of objective markers is the same as it was in 9th edition, I think this makes this ability extremely swingy. Either it can be that you basically will shadow the center of the battlefield for the entire game really easily, or it could be that your opponent has a super easy time pushing your shadow out of the center of the table, and meaning that most of the time it's not affecting the middle of the table. That said, there are other effects that will determine what areas of the board are within your shadow. So let's talk about those real real quick before we move on to the remainder of this ability. We're going to buck the normal trend of these videos and actually talk about the detachment stratagem for the demonic incursion detachment right now. This is corrupt real space and can be triggered at the start of any command phase while you are controlling an objective marker with a Legiones Daemonica unit. I guess importantly, it's that a Legiones Daemonica unit from your army is in range of a marker you control, so if you control it with something that doesn't have the keyword, but a demon unit is there, you can switch it. That might be relevant for Agents of Chaos or something like that. Once you use the stratagem, it gives you sticky objective control on that objective until your opponent controls it at the start of any turn. This is identical to the Shock Troops ability that we just saw over on the Astra Militarum article, and I think abilities like these are not only going to be a little bit more common in 10th edition, but also more crucial because of that confirmation we just had where failing Battle Shock prevents you from holding objectives. So being able to lock in an objective and hold it regardless of whether or not your Mook objective holders suffer Battle Shock is a huge deal. Now, the other effect of the stratagem is that as long as the objective marker remains corrupted, so remains under your control, it projects a 6-inch aura of Shadow of Chaos. Now, we see a similar interaction on the datasheet for Be'lakor, who has also been spoiled in this article. He has the Dark Master ability, which similarly projects your Shadow of Chaos to the area of the battlefield within 6 inches of him. So both he and any objective markers that you've been corrupting will also have mini areas of Shadow of Chaos. Obviously not as big as projecting it across the entirety of No Man's Land, but still extremely relevant. All right, so with all that in mind, what does Shadow of Chaos actually do? It has 3 specific effects within this detachment. The army rule itself adds +1 to battle shock tests for Legiones Daemonica units within the Shadow of Chaos area. Importantly, that's within, not completely within, so as long as your unit is touching your deployment zone or within 6 inches of Be'lakor or within 6 inches of that objective marker, even if it's only one model and a sliver of their base, the entire unit is going to be affected and get this bonus to battle shock. If you pass a battle shock test, you are going to regain D3 lost wounds. However, if you're a battle line unit, you will regain D3 destroyed models. Depending on the profiles of battle line units, this could be huge. If we see like Plague Bearers, for example, retain their 2 wounds, and those guys start to pass those battle shock tests and start regenerating potentially up to 6 wounds to a unit, they can be extremely difficult to remove. This also triggers any time you take a battle shock test, not just during your battle shock step in your command phase, which means that if your opponent is forcing battle shock tests on you, you may have the opportunity to regenerate models more than once per turn. So for example, if you're playing against Space Marines and fighting Infernus squads and they start forcing battle shock tests on all of your demon units at +1 leadership and potentially just regain all of the damage that those Infernus squads were able to deal to you. Now, the other effect of Shadow of Chaos is Demonic Terror. This affects enemy units within your Shadow of Chaos. Again, within, not completely within, so touching your deployment zone, touching 6 inches of Be'lakor, 6 inches of those corrupted objectives, or potentially just touching the no man's land of the table if you're controlling 3 objectives. To be fair, that one's pretty easy because all you have to do is control the center objectives at the end of your turn, and as long as you have at least half in no man's land, the entire no man's land get broadcasted when you move over to the opponent's command phase and they start taking their own battle shocks. This gives them -1 to those battle shock tests, and similarly to the demonic manifestation ability, if the test is failed, the enemy unit suffers D3 mortal wounds. So this is a little bit of a way to pile on some additional damage by forcing battle shocks, and I wouldn't be too surprised if we saw a lot of abilities within the Demon's Codex to force battle shock tests out of sequence. So while it's difficult to convert the No Man's Land into Shadow of Chaos for your own battle shock phase, what you can do is push your army forward, take those center objectives within your movement phase, push forward that Shadow of Chaos, reduce the morale of all your opponent's units, and then start forcing battle shocks on them to actually deal them physical damage. Last but certainly not least, we see a little bit of a return of the demonic manifestation ability. The entire Demon's army is confirmed to be using Deep Strike, so anything in the army can be put into reserve and set up 9 inches outside of enemies. However, if they are set up wholly within your army's Shadow of Chaos, this time it's wholly within, so the entire unit's entire bases have to be within that distance, 6 inches of Bellicor, for example, then instead of being 9 inches away from enemies with that deep strike, you can be 6 inches away. This basically makes the entire Shadow of Chaos a warp locus. It means that Bellicor is retaining essentially his warp locus ability from the 9th edition codex, and it means that demon reserves are going to be incredibly reliable, making those charges out of deep strike. Assuming the charges work the same way. We actually don't know. Now, what units are actually going to be brought out of those reserves? The first one that we have spoiled by the article is the Keeper of Secrets. The Keeper of Secrets has retained its relatively resilient and relatively fast profile, coming in at move 14. It does have the monster keyword, but we don't know how that interacts with terrain. Hopefully, there will be easier movements for monsters around terrain, and it won't be quite as harmed by the existence of ruin walls as we've seen previously. They are coming in at toughness 10 with a 5-up base save. However, they do have a 4+ invulnerable save, so most of the time that will be used instead. The massive 18 wounds, as well as leadership 6 and 5 objective control. Now, in 9th edition, 18 wounds would be a really bad cutoff because it basically converts you into a kind of pseudo-titanic unit where you don't benefit from dense cover or the obscuring keyword. However, in 10th edition, it looks like obscuring terrain like ruins will be checking for specifically the towering or aircraft keywords in order to determine whether or not they block line of sight to large units. So that 18 wound cutoff may actually be okay for the Keeper of Secrets, since now it looks like it will be able to actually hide behind obscuring terrain, despite the fact that it's very tall, obviously, and be protected by those ruins from early game shooting, against which it is slightly more susceptible because it has lost demonic invulnerability. We now just have normal invulnerable saves, so if there are weapons that ignore invulnerable saves, demons will be highly susceptible to them. I have a sneaking suspicion we'll see less of those in the new edition, but never say never, I guess. Now, the Keeper itself has the Lord of Slaanesh ability, giving +1 armor penetration to friendly Slaanesh units within 6 inches. I think that also applies to itself, meaning that with the overall reduction of armor penetration characteristics across the game, the Keeper of Secrets being almost universally AP3 is actually very impressive. It's also -1 to be hit permanently, both from ranged and melee attacks, and that makes it a lot tankier than its profile would initially appear. That toughness value of 10 is also very impactful when you're looking at its defensive stat line. Like we talked about in the previous video, we're seeing a lot of anti-tank weapons, at least sort of light anti-tank weapons like autocannons and crack grenade launchers come in at strength 9, meaning that toughness 10 is an important breakpoint to kind of blank a lot of that mid-weight weaponry. Even Leman Russ battle cannons are only going to be wounding this thing on 4s, so it's kind of the equivalent of toughness 8 from 9th edition. It also has the Shining Aegis. I assume that this may be a war gear option and it will have to give up its living whip, but it gives you a 5+ feel no pain. This seems incredible, and losing the whip is a small price to pay, especially since it's going to be casting that Phantasmagoria psychic power, so it will have a ranged attack regardless. But with 18 wounds, a 5+ feel no pain is a dramatic increase in survivability. It has the damaged characteristic, which reduces its hit rolls if it's reduced down to 30% of its wounds. Again, that Shining Aegis is going to make that tougher, and importantly, unlike a lot of the other pseudo super heavy vehicles that we've seen, this does not lose objective control when it's damaged. Its objective control remains 5 regardless of the number of wounds remaining, as long as it passes its battle shock tests, which, with a leadership of 6 and probably +1 to pass battle shock, the Keeper of Secrets is actually going to be just fine. And if it's within the Shadow of Chaos, it's going to be healing those wounds every time a battle shock is forced. It's not only unlikely to remain damaged, you almost want the Keeper of Secrets to be reduced down to below half starting strength, because it will then force that battle shock. And rolling a 5+ on 2d6 is pretty easy, which then allows it to regenerate wounds and potentially heal out of its damaged profile. So what are these profiles that it is attacking with? The first one I mentioned earlier is the Phantasmagoria psychic power, and it follows the trend of a lot of the psychic powers we've been seeing, being around strength 6, although coming in at AP2 rather than AP1. I guess Slaanesh has kind of a theme of having high AP weapons, so its psychic powers having higher AP than a normal smite kind of makes sense. It does have the ability to focus its Phantasmagoria, going from 6 attacks up to 9. All of those attacks are going to have an 18-inch range, 2+ ballistic skill at strength 6 and AP 2 for only 1 damage. But that high volume is pretty important, since the Keeper of Secrets is going to be able to clear light infantry pretty well with it. If you do elect to take the Living Whip, you get an additional 12-inch range, 6 attack, 2+ to hit, strength 6, AP 1, 2 damage profile. Importantly, while the Keeper can improve the armor penetration characteristic of its weapons, it is only melee weapons, so the ranged weapons and psychic powers are not affected. Speaking of those melee weapons, though, it does have quite a few of them, which has kind of always been a characteristic of the Keeper of Secrets. It has the Ritual Knife and Snapping Claw profiles, both of which come with that extra attacks characteristic, meaning that these attacks are made on top of the weapon that you choose to make your normal attacks with, which is for sure your Wit Stealer sword. So all told, you get 7 additional attacks plus 6 base attacks with the sword for a total of 13. Those attacks are all around a similar strength and AP value, but a little bit of different damage. The Ritual Knife is strength 6, AP 2 for 2 damage, but you have to keep in mind that this is most likely increased by +1 thanks to the Lord of Slaanesh ability, so they are going to be coming in at AP 3. The Snapping Claws has the Devastating Wounds characteristic, converting its damage to mortal wounds on wound rolls of 6, with 4 additional attacks at 2+ weapon skill, strength 6, AP 2 up to 3, and 3 damage. That actually makes the Snapping Claws pretty okay at clearing out infantry, because if you roll a 6 to wound, it's actually going to kill 3 1-wound models, which is pretty nice. And last but certainly not least, the Wit Stealer sword is what it's going to be using to punch tanks a little bit, coming in at strength 8, AP 2, so up to 3. For 3 damage. Now, one thing I think is a little bit sad about the Keeper of Secrets is the overall reduction in its strength characteristic. Because all of its extra attack weapons are only strength 6, they're going to wound most vehicles in the game on 5s and the large majority, I imagine, on 6s. The Wit Stealer sword also being strength 8 means that it's wounding every vehicle on 5s, most likely. So the Keeper of Secrets has very much been angled to be an infantry sweeper, or I guess a heavy infantry killer, rather than a vehicle destroyer. Now, we will see some profiles in this article that are extremely good against vehicles, so don't get me wrong, demons are not going to have a problem blowing up vehicles once they get to melee, but the Keeper of Secrets is very specifically not one of them. Unless we have any way to improve the wound roll or reroll wounds, for example, I don't really see a Keeper of Secrets doing that much damage to a vehicle. If we want to kill vehicles and potentially survive vehicle alpha strikes, the other model that we're going to look at is Be'lakor. We talked a little bit about Be'lakor earlier with his Dark Master ability projecting your Shadow of Chaos, but he also has some army support abilities from his Shadow form. He has a modal aura ability similar to Guilliman or Abaddon that we've seen previously, where at the start of the battle round, he selects 1 benefit to grant. These are either Pall of Despair, which forces all enemies within 6 inches to take Battle Shock during their opponent's Battle Shock test step, basically putting them all to below half of their starting strength to force those Battle Shock tests, and because those Battle Shock tests can do mortal wounds, that's pretty relevant. And also because they are within 6 inches of Be'lakor, they are forced to be within the Dark Master aura, so they're always going to be in Shadow of Chaos. Honestly, if you have low leadership values, this might be okay, but it seems, I mean, fine, I guess. If Be'lakor's up in your opponent's face and you are going second, I can see it be pretty good, because he can protect his army on the way in, and then once he gets there, potentially force Battle Shock and remove objective control value from all of your opponent's models. His second ability is Shadow Lord, which gives Legiones Daemonica units within 6 rerolls to Battle Shock and leadership tests. Because those leadership tests also heal demon units in addition to retaining their OC and allowing you to target them with stratagems, I think that this is going to be a pretty impactful one if you're not using his number 1 ability, Wreathed in Shadows. Wreathed in Shadows, I think, is his premier army support ability, and moves Be'lakor from being a one-man wrecking crew like he is in the 9th edition codex to being much more of an army support and almost defensively oriented character. Wreathed in Shadows prevents units within 6 inches of Be'lakor, assumingly targeting Be'lakor himself, from being targeted by ranged attacks from enemy models unless the attacking model is within 18 inches. Assuming that Be'lakor and all of his cronies deploy on the line, most deployment zones are likely to be 24 inches apart, meaning your opponent has to move at least 6 inches directly forward from the line of their own deployment zone in order to even have a chance to target anything within 6 inches of Be'lakor at all. Now, not only is that extremely dangerous for a lot of players, but also it means that there is not a lot of actual real estate on the table where your opponent's army can occupy it and still attack Be'lakor or the units that he's protecting. And to be fair, that's only if Be'lakor and his units he's protecting are deployed on the line. If he deploys farther back, deeper into your deployment zone, it can be difficult or impossible for your opponent to target him or the units he's protecting on the first turn. So while we're looking at datasheets like this Keeper of Secrets that has a toughness 10, a 4+ invulnerable save, a 5+ damage ignore, that's already relatively resilient, obviously we don't want it to get shot by, Oath to Moment Space Marines on the top of the first turn. Be'lakor standing next to that Keeper of Secrets makes it entirely immune to ranged attacks. So not only is it going to survive that first turn, it's going to run up the table and then use that powerful defensive profile to survive the subsequent shooting on the next turn and hopefully deliver it into melee. So while Be'lakor lost the absolute Chad level shadow form abilities that he had in the 9th edition codex, like -1 damage, -1 to hit, -1 to wound, the fact that he can now protect large majorities of your army on the first to second battle rounds from basically the entirety of your opponent's shooting, unless they're extremely fast or play extremely aggressively, is super good. And Demons being a melee army, if your opponent is running up within 18 inches of you to shoot you, you're just gonna charge them. Be'lakor is a move 12 model. If they're within 18 inches to charge Be'lakor, he will likely only have a 6-inch charge to hit them back. And remember, the damage mechanic does not affect your movement value anymore. Even if Be'lakor is at a single wound remaining, he's still gonna be move 12 and he's still gonna make a pretty reliable charge. That also brings them closer to your deployment zone, where you can potentially be bringing units in out of warp rifts. This ability is great, not because it makes you entirely immune to attacks or even that much more resilient to attacks, but it forces your opponent to engage with you, which is all that a Demon's army has ever wanted. Now, I shouldn't say that Be'lakor has lost all of his defensive mechanics, because he does have the stealth core ability. In the past, stealth-like abilities in 40k have been represented by light cover and a certain distance away, and I imagine that that's what this is, and the reason that Be'lakor now has a 4+ base armor save. He does have a 4+ invulnerable save, but a 4+ armor save with the benefit of cover brings him to a 3+, which means that AP0 shooting from a particular distance would be difficult to kill. Now, it's actually not that big of a deal. I think most of the time you're shooting at a unit like Be'lakor, you want to be hitting him with higher AP value weapons anyway. So I kind of hope that it's a hit penalty. -1 to hit from outside 12 or something would make sense. We'll just have to see. Now, when it comes to forcing your opponent to get up close and personal with Be'lakor and allowing him to attack, this guy has some incredible profiles to attack with. He has the Betraying Shades psychic power as his ranged attack, which is actually probably one of the most lethal psychic powers that we've seen yet. It starts with a base 9 attacks, hits on 2s with a strength 5 AP2 1 damage with the ignore, cover, and devastating wounds attributes. So mortal wounds on critical wound rolls of 6+, and you don't get your bonus to your cover save. At an already high AP value of 2, that's pretty good. However, it gets better because you can use the focused version to take the hazardous penalty, so hit rolls of 1 will deal a mortal wound to Be'lakor himself. It retains the devastating wounds and ignores cover attributes, however goes up to 12 attacks at strength 6 and AP 3. While that strength 6 value obviously not great against vehicles, it is going to wound most mid-weight vehicles on 5s, and at high AP, high volume, it's going to do some damage, but also has that devastating wounds characteristic, so some of those are going to automatically convert through. Against light infantry though, this is absolutely lethal. This thing will almost kill an entire guardsman squad on average with a single shot, even if they're standing in cover, even if they're being protected by the take cover order. And hopefully you can force the remaining casualties to take battle shock tests, which then, if they fail, they take D3 mortal wounds and die. Well, it's not going to blow up tanks. It is going to be enough to threaten them a little bit and gives Be'lakor something to do, as long as he's not running up the table. Once he gets up the table, he does retain his Blade of Shadows. Interestingly, the Blade of Shadows is depicted as having multiple profiles, a strike profile and a sweep profile, despite the fact that, as we just talked about elsewhere in this article, that's actually not necessary. You will pick one profile to use regardless. I wonder if there are effects in Demons that will affect single melee weapons, meaning that both profiles of the Blade of Shadows would benefit from them. That I don't know, but it is a strange idiosyncrasy. The Strike profile has the lethal hits ability, giving it automatic wound rolls on hit rolls of a 6. It's hitting on 2s with 6 attacks at strength 14, AP 4, D6 plus 1 damage. A D6 plus 1 benefit, a little bit of an upgrade to the D3 plus 3 of the previous Blade of Shadows. However, it has lost its ability to ignore invulnerable saves, which is very sad. Strength 14 is nice against lighter targets, but is going to be mostly the same against heavy targets. But it will wound big stuff like monoliths on 4s. as we've seen in the Necron article. Mostly a side grade, you do get that lethal hits, although the ability to ignore invulnerable saves is unfortunate. The sweep profile comes in at 14 attacks, so a little bit of an upgrade on the number of attacks made. At strength 8, AP3 for 1 damage. Be'lakor was always kind of hilariously inept at killing light infantry, and this profile is pretty good at doing it. So I don't have much to say there. They seem like pretty solid melee attacks. Now, one other thing I want to point out is that we have seen Allegiance-specific keywords on the Keeper of Secrets profile. It does have the Slanesh keyword. However, Be'lakor has lost his access to all 4 Allegiance keywords. Now, whether or not that's relevant in the new edition, we just don't know. We don't know if there are going to be specific effects for each Chaos God, and it seems like that might be a characteristic of Chaos Space Marines more than it is Chaos Demons. But it might be that it just makes Be'lakor unsusceptible to other auras. So, for example, he doesn't get +1 AP if he's standing next to a Keeper of Secrets. That might be the only effect there, but it is worth pointing out. Now, I did mention that there were some other anti-tank profiles beyond Be'lakor's Sword of Shadows in this article, and the one I want to talk about is for Skarbrand. Well, we did see the profile of one of the knives on the Great Unclean one. It was just used to showcase the extra attacks mechanic, and honestly isn't that exciting, so we'll sort of skip over that one. But we do see Slaughter and Carnage, Skarbrand's 2 axes. Now, these come in at kind of a side grade from the previous incarnation in 9th edition. It looks like the strike profile of Skarbrand's axes will have, unfortunately, similarly to Be'lakor's Blade of Shadows, lost its ability to ignore invulnerable saves. Again, I assume that this is something that will happen probably game-wide, so I'm not too shocked by it. However, while otherwise its abilities remained the same, it has gone from D3+3 damage to the flat 6 that we always wanted. It remains at 8 attacks, hitting on 2s at a massive strength of 16 and AP4. And Skarbrand will most likely have some additional effects for Khorne Chaos Demons that he will himself be affected by. And we don't know what his damage profile does. He may get significantly stronger when he's damaged, like he does at the current version. His sweep profile is mostly the same, but has gone down from AP2 down to AP1, but otherwise remaining basically identical at 16 attacks, 2 hitting on 2s at strength 8 with 2 damage. Overall, pretty sweet. 6 flat damage is
that's a lot of damage!
Now that's basically the entire article, but before we wrap up, I do want to talk about the other Chaos Demons army rule, Demonic Pact. This is the way that they get included in other Chaos armies besides normal Legionis Demonica armies. If your army has the Chaos keyword, you can include demon units in your army even though they don't share the faction keyword with you. You get a cap of points rather than a free detachment, so Strike Force games are going to be up to 500. It does look like that switch to Incursion versus Strike Force that was previewed previously might have been a typo. So a normal 2,000 point game of 40k, 25% of those points can be made up by demons. However, there are the restrictions that if you're World Eaters, you can only take Khorne. If you're Thousand Sons, you can only take Tzeentch. If you're Death Guard, you can only take Nurgle. And if your Warlord is Lucius, which I guess is sort of the shorthand for playing Emperor's Children, then you can only include Slanesh. Kind of weird that you can play Emperor's Children and take nothing but Noise Marines otherwise, but as long as you just don't take Lucius, you're good to go. You can take Tzeentch Demons or whatever. Just come out with an Emperor's Children supplement. Come on, you're doing indexes. Just roll out an index. Let's just rip this band-aid off. In my opinion, the coolest thing about this is that you're no longer restricted by detachment restrictions, meaning that you can just slap a Greater Demon into whatever of these detachments that you want. So if the Greater Demon profiles are sweet, you can roll one in there. The downside is that they can't take enhancements, which will probably be pretty transformative to how they work, but the upside is that you don't have to take troops or anything else if you don't want to. You could also just use this to take efficient demon units like Flamers or Fleshhounds, depending on how they survive the transition between editions. And with that, that is all of the demon profiles that we see for 10th edition Warhammer 40k. Let me know down in the comment section what you think about these. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everyone who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. Y'all are great. Remember to keep it classy, folks. Stay out of the shadow of chaos, and I'll see you in the next one.